In the autumn of 1936, Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered in the United States, marking what many consider the birth of feature-length animation as an art form. Across the Atlantic in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin watched American cartoons in his private Kremlin screening room, fascinated by their technical sophistication and their power to shape young minds. What followed was not mere imitation, but the creation of something entirely different, something that would puzzle and captivate Western audiences for decades to come. Soviet animation developed into a phenomenon so visually distinctive, so psychologically complex, and so seemingly disconnected from rational storytelling that the question remains urgent even today. Why were Soviet cartoons so profoundly, bewilderingly psychedelic? The answer lies not in artistic whimsy, but in a convergence of historical forces, ideological imperatives, censorship paradoxes, and the unique conditions of Soviet cultural production. To understand why films like Hedgehog in the Fog, Tale of Tales, and The Glass Harmonica emerged from behind the Iron Curtain looking like fever dreams animated by philosopher-poets, we must examine the specific ecosystem that produced them, an ecosystem shaped by Stalin's cultural policies, Khrushchev's thaw, Brezhnev's stagnation, and the peculiar economics of Soviet artistic labor. The foundation was laid in 1936 when Stalin personally ordered the creation of Soyuzmultfilm, the Soviet Union's primary animation studio, established in Moscow as a direct response to Disney's success. Stalin understood what many dictators throughout history have grasped. Children's entertainment is ideological battleground. The initial directive was clear and conventional. Soviet animation would teach socialist values, celebrate collective achievement, promote Soviet heroes, and counter the individualistic narratives pouring out of Hollywood. Early Soyuzmultfilm productions like The Little Gray Neck from 1948 were competent, traditional, and utterly unremarkable, technically proficient adaptations of Russian folk tales with clear moral messages about cooperation and bravery. But something unexpected happened in the wake of Stalin's death in 1953, and the subsequent Khrushchev thaw that began in earnest after Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin's cult of personality in 1956. The cultural loosening that followed created a strange paradox in Soviet animation. While live-action filmmakers, novelists, and poets found themselves navigating a minefield of political censorship, animators discovered they occupied a unique blind spot in the Soviet cultural apparatus. The censors, trained to detect political subversion in realistic narratives, in dialogue, in recognizable historical settings, often failed to understand the symbolic language of animation. A surreal image of a hedgehog dissolving into fog could pass through committees that would have banned a novel containing a single ambiguous sentence about Soviet life. This was not an accident of bureaucratic incompetence. It reflected a fundamental assumption within Soviet cultural policy. Animation was for children and children's entertainment, while ideologically important, was not where serious dissent would manifest. The censors were looking for Solzhenitsyn, not for subversive meaning in the way a cartoon horse's eyes reflected moonlight. This miscalculation created breathing room, and Soviet animators, many of them extraordinarily educated in literature, philosophy, and classical art, began to exploit it with increasing sophistication. The economic structure of Soviet animation reinforced this tendency toward the experimental and the strange. Unlike their American counterparts, Soviet animators were not producing content for profit. Soyuzmultfilm operated on state funding with production quotas measured not in box office returns, but in minutes of completed footage annually. Directors received salaries regardless of whether their films were popular, widely distributed, or even fully understood by their audiences. This removed the commercial pressure toward the formulaic and the immediately accessible. A director like Yuri Norstein could spend years perfecting a 29-minute film like Tale of Tales, completed in 1979, using frame-by-frame animation techniques so labor-intensive they would be economically impossible in a market system. The quota system itself created perverse incentives toward the psychedelic. Studios needed to produce a certain amount of content, but within that mandate there was substantial freedom regarding style and approach. Shorter films with smaller teams could experiment more radically than expensive features. The result was a proliferation of short-form animation, typically between 10 and 30 minutes, where directors had unusual creative latitude. Films like Andrei Kurjanovsky's The Glass Harmonica from 1968 emerged from this system, a 21-minute meditation on conformity and artistic freedom so visually bizarre and politically ambiguous that it was immediately banned, not because censors fully understood it, but because they sensed something dangerous in its imagery of identical gray figures and its celebration of individual creative expression. The visual strangeness of Soviet animation also emerged from its deliberate rejection of Disney's aesthetic principles. Soviet animation theorists, particularly Fyodor Kaitruk and later Yuri Norstein, explicitly criticized what they called the rubber hose style of American animation, its emphasis on smooth, bouncing movement, and its anthropomorphized animals with human emotions simplified for mass consumption. Soviet directors instead drew inspiration from avant-garde art movements that had flourished briefly in early Soviet Russia before Stalin's imposition of socialist realism. The geometric abstractions of Kazimir Malevich, the mystical symbolism of Marc Chagall, the constructivist experiments of Alexander Rodchenko, all these suppressed artistic traditions found refuge in animation, smuggled back into Soviet culture under the guise of children's entertainment. Consider the work of Yuri Norstein, whose 1975 film Hedgehog in the Fog has been repeatedly voted the greatest animated film ever made in international polls. The film follows a small hedgehog traveling through increasingly dense fog to visit his friend the bear cub, encountering strange, dreamlike phenomena along the way. A white horse that appears and disappears, an owl with glowing eyes, mysterious sounds and shadows. The narrative is minimal, almost non-existent by conventional standards. The film's power lies entirely in its atmosphere, in the way Norstein used multiple layers of glass to create depth and translucency, in the way the fog itself becomes a character, simultaneously threatening and beautiful. There is no clear ideological message, no obvious moral, nothing that resembles propaganda. Yet the film passed through Soviet censorship because it could be interpreted as a simple children's story about a hedgehog in fog, which it literally was, even as it functioned on deeper levels as a meditation on perception, fear, friendship, and the unknown. The educational background of Soviet animators contributed significantly to the philosophical and literary density of their work. Unlike the American animation industry, which drew heavily from commercial art and comic strips, Soviet animation recruited from fine arts academies, literary institutes, and theater schools. Directors like Andrei Kurjanovsky, son of the poet Danil Karms, brought deep knowledge of Russian literary tradition. His films adapted Pushkin, Mayakovsky, and Karms himself, but adapted them in ways that emphasized the surreal, the absurdist, and the psychologically complex elements of these works. The 1982 film I Am With You, based on Karms's work, presented a fragmented, non-linear narrative that reflected both the poet's absurdist style and the traumatic discontinuities of Soviet history itself. The influence of Russian Orthodox iconography, though officially suppressed in atheist Soviet society, permeated Soviet animation in subtle ways. The flat, stylized figures in many Soviet cartoons, the use of gold and deep colors, the emphasis on symbolic rather than realistic representation, all echoed the visual language of icons. Directors like Norstein explicitly studied icon painting, understanding its techniques for suggesting spiritual depth through visual layering. This religious aesthetic tradition, transformed and secularized, gave Soviet animation a contemplative, mystical quality, utterly foreign to the energetic literalism of American cartoons. The political environment of the Brezhnev era, from 1964 to 1982, created what cultural historians call stagnation. But for animation, this stagnation was paradoxically liberating. As the Soviet leadership aged and ossified, as ideological fervor gave way to cynical careerism, censorship became simultaneously more arbitrary and more predictable. Animators learned to navigate the system, understanding that overt political content would be scrutinized while symbolic abstraction could slip through. The result was a kind of Aesopian language in visual form, where meaning was encoded in color, composition, and metaphor, rather than in dialogue or explicit narrative. Roman Kachanov's Cheburashka series, beginning in 1969, illustrates this dynamic perfectly. On the surface, these were simple stories about a strange, unidentifiable creature with enormous ears and his friend, a crocodile named Gina. The films were wildly popular with Soviet children and seemed ideologically harmless. But Cheburashka himself was a profound metaphor for Soviet life. A creature who didn't fit any category, who was rejected by the zoo because they had no classification for him, who existed in a bureaucratic limbo. Soviet audiences understood this subtext immediately, even as censors saw only a cute character suitable for merchandising. The technical limitations of Soviet animation paradoxically enhanced its psychedelic qualities. Lacking the resources for smooth, expensive animation, Soviet studios developed distinctive styles that embraced roughness, texture, and visual experimentation. The cutout animation technique, using physical materials like paper, fabric, and natural objects, created a handmade aesthetic that felt organic and strange. Films like The Battle of Kurzhenets from 1971, directed by Yuri Norstein and Ivan Ivanov-Vano, used this technique to adapt a Russian Orthodox legend, creating imagery that looked like ancient frescoes come to life, with stylized warriors and horses moving in jerky, ritualistic patterns across the screen. The sound design of Soviet cartoons contributed to their otherworldly atmosphere. Unlike American animation, which relied heavily on synchronized dialogue and musical comedy, many Soviet animations used sparse, carefully chosen sound effects, long stretches of silence, and classical or avant-garde musical scores. Eduard Nazarov's 1978 film, Once Upon a Time There Was a Dog, used traditional Ukrainian folk music and minimal dialogue to create a melancholy mood that was simultaneously funny and deeply sad. The film's climax, where the dog and wolf howl together at the moon, became iconic precisely because it captured something about Russian emotional culture that couldn't be expressed in words. A kind of joyful fatalism, a celebration of friendship in the face of inevitable hardship. The internationalism of the Soviet animation scene also played a role in its distinctive character. Soyuz Multfilm and other Soviet studios regularly collaborated with animators from across the Eastern Bloc, Czechoslovakia, Poland, East Germany, Yugoslavia. These countries had their own rich animation traditions, often even more experimental than Soviet work. Czech animators like Jan Svankmajer and Jiří Trnka pioneered surrealist stop-motion techniques that influenced Soviet directors. Polish poster art, with its bold graphics and symbolic imagery, shaped the visual style of many Soviet films. This cross-pollination created a shared Eastern European aesthetic that was psychedelic not in the Western sense of drug-inspired hallucination, but in a deeper sense of presenting reality as fundamentally strange, symbolic, and multi-layered. The late Soviet period, from the late 1970s through the mid-1980s, saw the apex of Soviet animation's experimental phase. As the gerontocracy in the Kremlin lost its grip on cultural production, as economic stagnation made ideological enforcement increasingly hollow, animators pushed boundaries with increasing boldness. Films like Gary Barden's Conflict from 1983, using matches as characters to depict war, presented anti-war messages with a directness that would have been impossible in live-action cinema. The film showed matches literally consuming each other in flames, a visceral metaphor for mutual destruction that resonated powerfully in the late Cold War period. The philosophical depth of Soviet animation reflected a broader cultural context where intellectual life, suppressed in public discourse, flourished in kitchens, in samizdat literature, and in art that could encode meaning symbolically. Soviet citizens became expert readers of subtext, trained by decades of reading between the lines of Pravda, of understanding what was really meant by official pronouncements. This cultural literacy extended to animation, where audiences could decode layers of meaning that foreign viewers might miss entirely. A film like The Seasons from 1969, directed by Ivan Ivanov Vano, appeared to be a simple visualization of Tchaikovsky's music. But Soviet viewers understood it as a meditation on the cycles of Russian history, on the way beauty and terror alternated like winter and spring. The question of whether Soviet animators were consciously creating psychedelic art, or whether this quality emerged organically from their circumstances, is complex. Certainly, some directors were aware of Western psychedelic culture. By the 1970s, information about Western art movements, including psychedelic poster art and experimental animation, circulated in Soviet artistic circles through samizdat and limited cultural exchanges. But the psychedelic quality of Soviet animation was not primarily derivative. It emerged independently from a similar impulse: the desire to represent consciousness, perception, and reality in ways that transcended literal representation, to show that the world was stranger, deeper, and more meaningful than official narratives acknowledged. The censorship paradox reached its peak, with films that were completed but never widely distributed. The Glass Harmonica, Korzeniowski's 1968 masterpiece, sat on the shelf for decades, shown only at closed screenings. The film depicted a city where conformist gray figures suppress an artist who plays a glass harmonica, producing music that makes people see in color. The allegory was too transparent, the critique too obvious, yet the film's visual style was so innovative, so unlike anything else being produced anywhere in the world, that it became legendary in animation circles. When it finally received wider distribution in the Glasnost era, Western viewers were stunned by its visual sophistication, and its unflinching critique of conformity, created nearly 20 years before the Soviet system began to openly acknowledge its failures. The economic collapse that accompanied Glasnost and Perestroika devastated Soviet animation. As state funding evaporated, as studios were forced to become commercially viable, as animators fled to advertising and commercial work, the unique ecosystem that had produced such strange and beautiful work disintegrated. Soyuz Multfilm, once employing hundreds of artists, shrank to a skeleton crew. The long production timelines that had allowed Norstein to spend years on single films became impossible. The post-Soviet animation industry that emerged in the 1990s was leaner, more commercial, and far less experimental. Yet the legacy of Soviet animation persists, increasingly recognized as one of the great artistic achievements of the 20th century. Film festivals, retrospectives, and scholarly studies have elevated works that were once seen as mere children's entertainment into the canon of world cinema. Yuri Norstein is now recognized alongside the greatest animators in history. Films like Hedgehog in the Fog and Tale of Tales are studied in film schools worldwide, analyzed for their technical innovation and their emotional depth. The psychedelic quality that once seemed like a curious aberration is now understood as integral to their artistic vision, a way of representing the complexity of human consciousness and the strangeness of existence under Soviet power. The deeper answer to why Soviet cartoons were so psychedelic lies in understanding that psychedelic does not simply mean colorful or strange. It means mind-manifesting, revealing hidden layers of perception and meaning. Soviet animators, working within a system that demanded ideological conformity while providing the economic security to experiment, that suppressed explicit dissent while failing to understand symbolic language, that isolated them from commercial pressures while connecting them to deep artistic traditions, created works that manifested the Soviet mind, its literary sophistication, its philosophical preoccupations, its capacity for reading multiple meanings simultaneously, its experience of living in a reality where official narratives and lived experience constantly diverged. The strangeness of these films was not arbitrary but essential, a visual language for expressing truths that could not be spoken directly. When we watch these films today, their psychedelic quality remains powerful because it speaks to something universal: the gap between how we are told to see the world and how we actually experience it. The persistence of mystery and beauty in systems designed to eliminate both. The human need to create meaning in spaces of restriction. Soviet animation was psychedelic because Soviet reality was psychedelic, a place where the official and the actual existed in parallel dimensions, where survival required seeing multiple truths simultaneously, where the most profound statements about human existence could only be made through a hedgehog walking through fog, a strange creature rejected by the zoo, or a glass harmonica that made people see in color. These were not escapes from Soviet reality, but its most honest representations, encoded in a visual language that censors could not read, but that audiences understood perfectly. A testament to the indestructible human capacity to find freedom in the most constrained circumstances, to create beauty in the spaces power fails to monitor, and to speak truth in languages authority cannot comprehend.